It is 4:17 in the afternoon in a one-bedroom apartment above a shuttered laundromat in Barberton, Ohio, and Gene Ostrowski is just now opening his eyes. The blinds are drawn against the daylight, because daylight is not for him. Not really. Not anymore. A radiator ticks somewhere in the wall. A cat named Rusty is asleep in the flat, warm patch of afternoon sun that has found its way through the one gap in the blinds, and Gene lies there for a moment, listening to the traffic on Worcester Road and letting his eyes adjust to a day that is already halfway finished for everyone else in it. He has coffee to make, a shower to take, a can of soup to heat, and a drive of 11 miles ahead of him. By the time most of Barberton is thinking about supper, Gene will be thinking about work. His work happens to start close to the hour when other people's work ends, and it happens to take place inside a shopping mall after the mall has gone dark. Tonight we are going to spend a full day and a full night with Gene Ostrowski. We are going to follow him from the moment he wakes in that quiet apartment through his drive to Meadowbrook Galleria, through the last hour the mall is open to the public, through the long climate-controlled midnight, when he and a handful of other people are the only human beings inside a building built for 10,000, and into the grey hour, when the doors unlock again, and the whole cycle starts over. This is 1986. This is the shopping mall at the absolute peak of its cultural life. The place where an entire generation learnt to flirt and to shoplift and to waste an afternoon, and we are going to see it from the one angle almost nobody who was a teenager there ever thought to look. We are going to see it from the angle of the man who made it look effortless. This is the era when a shopping mall was not merely a place to buy things, but very nearly a rite of passage. The site of first dates and first jobs and endless aimless afternoons that a whole generation would later remember with a strange, specific tenderness. By the time we are finished tonight, you will have walked every hour of a single ordinary Thursday inside one of these buildings, from the last customer leaving to the first one returning. And I suspect the mall you carry in your own memory will feel afterward a little more complete than it did an hour ago. Before we go any further, if the kind of evening where you get to just exist inside somebody else's ordinary night is the kind of evening that works for you, I would be grateful if you would subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it helps this keep going. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments what time it is where you are right now, and whether you ever worked a shift that started after everyone else had gone home. I read every one of them. Wherever you are tonight, however late it has gotten, I am glad you are here. The parking lot is already going gold and orange at the edges by the time Gene backs his Buick out of its spot behind the laundromat. The sky over Ohio in November does this thing where it gives up on daylight, slowly, reluctantly, the way a store gives up on a going-out-of-business sale, marking the light down a little more each hour until there is nothing left to sell. He drives past a big boy, past a gas station advertising unleaded at 89 cents a gallon, past a strip of ranch houses with their porch lights just beginning to come on. Meadowbrook Galleria sits a little further out, past the edge of town, in the flat stretch of land where a cornfield used to be, and where, in 1986, 140 acres of asphalt now hold something closer to 4,000 cars on a Saturday. Tonight is a Thursday, and the lot is maybe half full, headlights sweeping across headlights as the last of the daytime shoppers look for a spot near Sears before the cold gets any worse. He keeps the radio off during the drive itself, an old habit from the years right after Carol died, when the silence of the car felt like the only honest hour of his whole day, and he watches the strip malls thin out into the open stretch of county road that leads to Meadowbrook, a McDonald's giving way to a stretch of harvested cornfield giving way, finally, to the mall's own enormous illuminated sign rising up out of the flat dark like a lighthouse built for cars instead of ships. He is going to walk into that mall in about 40 minutes, while it is still bright and loud and full of people, and by the time his shift ends, the whole building will belong to him and to 4 or 5 other people, and to nobody else on earth. That is the day we are going to spend together tonight, friend, not the mall you remember from being 16. The one that existed after you went home. Meadowbrook Galleria opened in the autumn of 1971, back when the developers who built these places still talked about them the way earlier generations talked about railroads, as a kind of manifest destiny made of steel beams and skylights. It was built where 3 county roads used to cross a stretch of farmland, and the men who financed it bet correctly that the families moving out of Akron's older streetcar neighborhoods would rather drive 12 minutes to a warm, dry, weatherless building than park downtown in the wind off Lake Erie. By 1986, the bet has paid off completely. The mall is anchored on one end by a 2-story Sears, all hard tile and hardware, and a paint department that smells faintly of turpentine. And on the other end by Higbee's, the Cleveland department store chain, whose perfume counter alone occupies more square footage than most of the little shops that came after it. In between run 2 long climate-controlled corridors lined with something like 90 storefronts, a center court with a tiled fountain and a bank of ficus trees in enormous concrete planters, and a food court added on in a renovation 4 years ago, when the developers realized that people would stay longer and spend more if they never had to leave to eat. Walk through the doors on any afternoon this autumn and the mall announces itself before your eyes have even adjusted. The air smells like 3 or 4 things fighting for supremacy at once. Cinnamon and sugar from the pretzel stand near Center Court, the chemical sweetness of an Orange Julius blender working overtime, and underneath it, faint but constant, the specific smell of hairspray drifting out of a salon called Great Clips. Muzak plays from speakers set into the ceiling tile, a string arrangement of something that used to be a Fleetwood Mac song before somebody stripped the vocals and the guitar out of it and left only the melody, smoothed and inoffensive, meant to be felt rather than heard. Teenagers move through the corridors in loose clusters, high tops and acid-washed denim, and hair sprayed into shapes that would not survive a strong wind, and none of them are actually shopping. They are here because the mall is warm and well lit and their parents are not, and because there is nowhere else in a town like this for a 15-year-old to be seen. The rhythm of the place changes by the hour in a way a person could set a clock by, if a clock were ever needed inside a building with no windows. In the hour after the doors open at 10, the corridors belong almost entirely to a loose fellowship of retirees who arrive not to shop but to walk, dozens of them making slow, purposeful laps of the mall's mile and a quarter of interior corridor before the crowds arrive and the aisles fill in, a practice that mall management in cities across the country had begun quietly encouraging, opening the doors an hour early and asking nothing in return beyond the goodwill of having helped. By mid-morning the walkers give way to mothers with strollers, moving in and out of Higbee's and the smaller shops with the unhurried patience of people whose whole day is built around naps and feedings. The afternoon belongs to the teenagers, arriving in waves as the area's high schools let out, and the evening, from 6 until close, belongs to families finishing a workday with dinner at the food court and a walk past the window displays, the entire building functioning less like a single business than like a small covered town with its own overlapping shifts of citizens. There is a specific constellation of stores that a person could have found in nearly any American mall built in this era, and Meadowbrook Galleria has all of them. A Sam Goody for records and cassette tapes, a Spencer's Gifts selling blacklight posters and joke gifts that no teenager would dare bring home to their parents, a Walden Books with paperback bestsellers stacked in the window, a Radio Shack smelling faintly of hot soda and new plastic, a Foot Locker with a wall of sneakers arranged like trophies behind glass. These stores were not unique to any one town. They were part of a template, repeated with only minor variation from Ohio to Oregon, so that a 15-year-old visiting a cousin in another state could walk into an unfamiliar mall and feel, within about 30 seconds, entirely at home. The economics of the place are worth noticing even before we meet anyone who works inside it. A movie ticket at the 6-screen theater bolted onto the mall's east wing costs $3.50. A slice of pizza at Sparrow runs about $1.25. A large soft pretzel from Auntie Anne's competitor down the corridor $1 even. And a pair of Jordache jeans from one of the mall's specialty shops close to $40, which is roughly a full day's pay for the teenager working the register who sold them to you. The federal minimum wage in 1986 is $3.35 an hour, and it has been frozen at that number since 1981. Which means the 16-year-old folding sweaters at the Gap and the retired steelworker running the cash register at Spencer's are, on paper, worth exactly the same amount per hour to the economy that employs them. Nobody walking through Meadowbrook Galleria on a Thursday afternoon in November is thinking about any of this. That is rather the point of the place. It was built to make you forget what things cost, at least for the length of the afternoon, and to remember only that you wanted them. Everything in the building is designed to erase the outside world along with its weather. There are no windows at eye level anywhere in the mall, only the enormous pyramid skylights over the food court, which let in daylight but nothing else. No wind, no temperature, no sense of what season it actually is outside. You could walk into Meadowbrook Galleria in July or January, and the only clue would be the merchandise in the windows and the coats on the shoppers' arms. This was intentional. The architect who designed the first generation of enclosed malls in America, a man named Victor Gruen, wanted exactly this effect. A controlled interior climate that felt like a permanent, temperate, endless spring, a little European piazza transplanted into a cornfield and roofed over against the actual Ohio sky. Gruen himself, by most accounts, came to hate what his invention became, all consumption and no community, but by 1986 nobody walking through Meadowbrook Galleria has ever heard his name. They only know that it is 72 degrees inside no matter what it is doing outside, and that the fountain in Center Court is always running, and that the whole building seems to hum along on its own, requiring, as far as any shopper can tell, absolutely nobody to maintain it. The materials underfoot and overhead were chosen with the same theatrical intention. The main corridors run on a terrazzo tile the color of wet sand, flecked through with tiny chips of colored stone, tough enough to survive a decade of shopping cart wheels and winter boots dragging in rock salt from the parking lot. Escalators rise on either side of Center Court with handrails polished to a brass-colored shine that never quite fades, and the food court sits beneath a soaring lattice of white steel trusses supporting the great pyramid skylights, a structure meant to evoke, in the language of the trade magazines that covered its opening in 1971, a European market hall, though nothing about 140 acres of parking asphalt outside would have fooled anyone who had actually stood inside a European market hall. Wooden benches line the wider stretches of corridor, and the enormous ficus trees rise out of concrete planters faced in the same terrazzo as the floor, watered and pruned twice a week by a landscaping contractor entirely separate from diversified building services, one more invisible vendor keeping one more piece of the illusion alive. Higbee's had already strung its window displays with the first of the season's decorations 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. A fake Christmas tree standing in the corner of the men's department, and a recorded loop of carols layered in beneath the mall's ordinary background music near that end of the building. An early start that would have struck an outside observer as almost aggressive were it not, by 1986, already standard practice at malls across the country. That background music itself came from a company called Muzak, which held contracts with shopping centers nationwide and piped in its carefully engineered mood-neutral arrangements through a subscription billed monthly. The same way a store might pay for its electricity or its trash pickup. Nobody who designed a mall's soundscape wanted a shopper to notice the music consciously. They wanted it felt only as an absence of silence, one more small mechanism, alongside the climate control and the fountain and the recessed lighting, built to make 3 hours disappear from an afternoon without ever quite registering as time passing at all. That is the illusion the mall was built to sell. It required, in truth, quite a lot of people. and by 10 o'clock tonight, when the last of them have gone home to bed, we are going to meet the ones who make it possible. Gene Ostrowski is 47 years old, and until 5 years ago, he had never in his life expected to end up cleaning floors for a living. He spent 22 years at the BF, Goodrich plant in Akron, on the line that cured rubber into truck tires, coming home every night smelling of something acrid and warm that his late wife Carol used to call his second cologne. Akron called itself the rubber capital of the world for most of the 20th century, and for a while that was simply true. Goodrich and Goodyear and Firestone and General Tire all running plants within a few miles of each other, employing something close to 70,000 people at the industry's peak. Gene was one of those 70,000. He is not one of them anymore. The plant where he worked cut its production lines through the late 70s and finally closed the doors on his department in 1981, part of a wave that emptied out Akron's rubber industry almost entirely inside of a decade, and Gene, along with a great many men his age, discovered in his early 40s that the trade he had built an entire life around no longer existed anywhere near his home. He found his way to Meadowbrook Galleria through a contracting company called Diversified Building Services, which holds the janitorial contract for the mall and for 2 office parks besides. Gene is not, technically, an employee of the mall at all. He works for a contractor who works for the mall, which is a distinction that will matter more than you might think when we come back to it later tonight. He started as one man on a crew of 6, learnt the floor buffer and the trash compactor and the exact chemistry of stripping 12-year-old wax off of terrazzo tile. And within 2 years he was made crew lead, the one who signs the other men in, who walks the building with a clipboard before anyone else starts, who decides which corridor gets the buffer tonight and which one only gets a dust mop and a spot check. It pays $6 an hour, which is nearly double the federal minimum and considerably less than Goodrich once paid him. And it comes with no pension and no union, only a laminated badge that says his name and, beneath it, the words Diversified Building Services in smaller type than Meadowbrook Galleria above it. As crew lead, Gene's responsibilities run a little beyond the buffer and the clipboard. He is the one who calls in the supply order each month to a distributor in Akron for wax and ammonia and replacement mop heads. The one who trained Marcus on the buffer his first week and made him practice on the loading dock concrete before ever letting him near the tile out front. And the one who meets, once a quarter, with a mall day manager named Phil Ranallo to go over any complaints that have come in about a smudged window or an overflowing trash can near the arcade. Phil is polite enough in these meetings and utterly incurious beyond them. In 5 years, he has never once asked Gene a question about his life outside the building, and Gene has never much minded. Since the arrangement, he figures, cuts both ways, he still keeps his old union card from the United Rubber Workers in the top drawer of his dresser, laminated and a little yellowed at the edges. Tucked beneath a stack of Carol's recipe cards he has never been able to bring himself to throw away. He does not look at it often. When he does, it is usually late on a Sunday, after he has hung up the phone with Denise, and he allows himself a few minutes of a feeling that is not quite regret, and not quite anger, closer to the specific ache of having belonged to something that no longer exists anywhere for anyone. He has never told his crew this. Marcus and Thelma know him only as the quiet man who runs Corridor A and signs the time cards, and that is, by Gene's own choosing, exactly as much as they need to know. Carol died in the spring of 1983, a heart that gave out at 51 without much warning, and Gene has lived alone since, except for Rusty the cat, who arrived on his porch one winter and simply never left. His daughter Denise is 23 now and in her second year of nursing school at the University of Akron, living 40 minutes away in a shared apartment with 2 other students, and Gene keeps a photograph of her graduation from Barberton High taped inside his locker at the mall, curling slightly at one corner from the humidity of the break room. He calls her most Sundays. He is, by the account of everyone who works with him, a quiet man, Not unfriendly, simply economical with his words, in the way of a lot of men who spent their working lives around machinery, loud enough that conversation was never really the point of a shift. He is a broad-shouldered man who has kept most of the strength the rubber plant built into him. Though his hair has gone fully grey, and his knees complain now on cold mornings the way they never used to, he shaves every evening before his shift rather than every morning, a small reversal of ordinary habit that took him the better part of a year to get used to, and he still, 5 years in, sometimes catches himself setting an alarm for 6 in the morning out of old instinct before remembering that 6 in the morning belongs, in his current life, to the tail end of the workday rather than the start of it. He holds one private opinion he has never much shared with anyone, which is that he preferred Akron's old downtown shopping district, the one that withered through the 70s as places like Meadowbrook Galleria pulled its customers out toward the highway. Carol used to take Denise, as a little girl, to a 5 and dime on South Main Street that had a lunch counter and a woman behind it who knew their names, and Gene sometimes thinks, running his buffer down a corridor lined with the same 40 national chains a person could find in any state in the country, that something real got traded away for something merely convenient. He does not say this to Frank or to Thelma or to anyone at all. It would sound, he suspects, like an old man complaining about progress, and he has never wanted to be that kind of old man, even in his own head. Here is a detail that tells you more about him than his job title does. Gene keeps a small transistor radio clipped to his belt loop every night, tuned low, and while he runs the buffer down the long corridor past the shoe stores, he listens to whatever Cleveland Indians game is being replayed, or, out of season, to a call-in show out of Cleveland where lonely men argue about football at 1 in the morning. He has never once, in 5 years, missed a night of it, and the other men on the crew have learned to time their own breaks by which inning Gene is on when they pass him in the hall. This is not a large fact. It will not appear in any history of the American shopping mall, but it is the kind of detail that tells you Gene Ostrowski built himself a small private world to live inside during the hours when the rest of the world was asleep, the way a man alone in a very large building tends to do, and it is worth knowing before we watch him work. He has also, over the past year, taken to reading a few pages of one of Denise's old nursing textbooks whenever she leaves one behind on her infrequent visits home. Not out of any ambition to change professions at 47, but out of a plain curiosity about what fills his daughter's days, and a wish to have something to ask her about on the phone besides the weather and the cat. He would never call this studying. He would call it, if pressed, just something to do with his hands on his day off, though Denise has noticed and finds it one of the more quietly touching facts of her father's life. Tonight's shift, like every Thursday, will run from 6 in the evening until roughly 7 the next morning. A full 13 hours with a paid half-hour for a meal break somewhere around midnight. His clipboard tonight lists the same duties it lists most nights. Sweep and mop the food court after closing when the grease from the day's frying has had time to cool into something manageable. Run the buffer down Corridor A, the long stretch between Sears and the Fountain. Because Corridor A gets the buffer on Mondays and Thursdays, while Corridor B gets it on Tuesdays and Fridays, an arrangement Gene worked out himself 2 years ago and has never had reason to change. Empty every trash can in the food court and the 2 nearest the arcade. Check the restrooms twice. Walk the full perimeter of the building once before he leaves, checking that every storefront gate is down and locked, a habit that started as a courtesy to the overnight security guard and became, somewhere along the way, simply part of what Gene considers his job to be, whether or not it appears on the clipboard. He arrives at the mall's loading dock behind Sears at 5:50. Badges through a service door that the daytime shoppers walk past every day without ever noticing it is there, and clocks in on a machine that stamps his time card with a small mechanical stutter. The exact same stamp, the exact same stutter, every single night. Somewhere out front, past the wall he is standing behind, several thousand people are still shopping under bright light, and Muzak, entirely unaware that the man who will make their footprints disappear by morning has just walked in the back door to begin. It is 6 o'clock, and Gene's first duty of the night is one that never appears on any clipboard, which is simply to become invisible. He changes in a supply closet the size of a large bathroom, out of the flannel shirt he drove in wearing and into a set of grey coveralls with diversified building services stitched over the breast pocket, and the moment he steps back out onto the mall floor, something shifts in how people see him, or rather stop seeing him. A woman pushing a stroller steps around him without looking up. 2 teenagers coming out of Spencer's Gifts, laughing about something, part around him the way water parts around a stone in a creek, their eyes sliding past the grey coveralls entirely. Gene has noticed this every night for 5 years, and it no longer surprises him. The uniform does something particular to the human eye. It tells the brain, this person is part of the architecture, and the brain, being efficient, stops registering him as a person at all. He starts his shift the way he starts every shift, walking the full length of Corridor A with his clipboard, checking off which trash cans are full, which light fixtures have a bulb gone dark, which storefront has left a spill unattended near its entrance. The mall at 6 in the evening on a Thursday in November is still very much alive. The record store near the food court has the new Bon Jovi record playing loud enough to bleed out into the corridor. A line has formed at the movie theatre box office for the 7:15 showing. Somewhere behind him, a group of kids are feeding quarters into the machines at Aladdin's castle, the arcade wedged between a shoe store and a place that sells nothing but greeting cards, and the electronic chirping and explosions of a dozen different games layer over each other into a single continuous digital roar. Gene walks through all of it with his clipboard, marking down a burned-out fixture outside Waldenbooks, and nobody in the entire crowded corridor gives him a second look. Near Center Court, a 2-man crew from a company that runs Santa photo booths at malls across 3 counties is testing the lighting rig for a set that will not officially open until the day after Thanksgiving, adjusting a spotlight aimed at an empty velvet chair while a 3rd man threads an extension cord along the baseboard, taping it down with silver duct tape so nobody trips over it come Saturday. Gene has watched this same seasonal ritual assemble itself for 5 Novembers running, the velvet chair and the fake presents and the roped-off waiting line, and there is something almost comforting in its punctuality, the way the whole apparatus of Christmas arrives in exactly the same order, on exactly the same weekend, regardless of what else has changed in the world since the year before. The arcade itself runs almost entirely on quarters fed into 24 machines with names like Frogger and Centipede and Track and Field, each game costing 25 cents for a few minutes of a teenager's attention. And on a Good Friday or Saturday night, Aladdin's castle can pull in several $100s in quarters alone. Money that a manager empties from the coin boxes twice a week and hauls to a bank 2 doors down inside a locked canvas bag. Gene has helped carry that bag exactly once, filling in for a manager caught in traffic, and he remembers being faintly astonished at the weight of that many quarters, a physical reminder of just how much idle attention this one small room was worth to somebody's bottom line. By 6:30, the food court has entered its dinner rush. Trays of chili dogs and orange chicken and thick wedges of Sparrow pizza carried to tables by families still in their work clothes, fathers loosening ties, mothers herding children past the cookie counter with a firmness that rarely holds. Gene walks past all of it on his way to find Thelma, and though nobody at any of those tables would think to look up at a man in grey coveralls carrying a clipboard, he catalogues the scene anyway, out of habit, the way any experienced worker learns to read a room even when the room has no reason to read him back. A spill near table 12. A napkin dispenser running low near the pizza counter. Small things, filed away for later, the way a man in his position learns to file almost everything away for later. At 7, before the busiest part of the evening arrives in earnest, Gene eats half a sandwich standing up in the break room, saving the other half for his midnight meal break, a habit left over from his years at Goodrich when the lunch whistle never quite lined up with an actual appetite, and a man learned to eat in installments instead. He finds Thelma Broyles near the food court, already pulling the rolling mop bucket out of its closet. Thelma is 61, a widow herself, who worked the register at a downtown Akron Five and Dime for 11 years before it closed in the 70s and has been cleaning food courts and office buildings ever since. She and Gene do not talk much, but they have an understanding built over 3 years of working the same nights, and she raises 2 fingers at him without looking up, which means 2 of the fryers at the pizza place have been leaking grease onto the tile again, and she will need the heavy degreaser tonight. He raises his own hand back, which means he heard her, and keeps walking. There is a whole language between the people who work a building like this at night, made almost entirely of small gestures, because shouting over the muzak and the arcade noise is more effort than it is worth, and because, frankly, neither of them has ever been much for talking. The other member of tonight's crew is Marcus Feeney, 20 years old, working nights at the mall to save money for community college classes he is taking during the day, running on something close to 5 hours of sleep most weeks. Gene worries about him a little, the way he worries about Denise, though he would never say so out loud. He assigns Marcus the food court trash tonight and the restroom check, the 2 jobs that require energy and speed rather than the patient, repetitive strength that the floor buffer demands, and Marcus takes off at something close to a jog, headphones already in, a Sony Walkman clipped to his belt. Around 8:30, Gene helps the stock crew at Higby's Wheel, a delivery of boxed winter coats back to the receiving dock, work that is not technically his, but that nobody minds him doing, because an extra set of hands after a delivery truck runs late is worth more than a rulebook. It is here, hauling boxes past the perfume counter with a Higby's stock clerk half his age, that you get the clearest sense of what this job actually is. Now here is where most people get the picture of a mall completely wrong. They imagine the building runs on some kind of autopilot overnight, humming along on its own timers and thermostats until the doors reopen. It does not. It runs every single night on a small and shifting cast of human beings, quietly propping the whole machine up from behind, restocking it and cleaning it and hauling its deliveries, almost none of whom the daytime shoppers could pick out of a lineup. There is also, most Thursdays, an older man named Harold who arrives around 7 and sits on the same bench near the fountain until the lights start dimming for close, having, as far as Gene has ever been able to tell, no obvious reason to be there beyond the warmth and the company of strangers passing by. Harold nods at Gene most nights, and Gene nods back, and neither of them has ever exchanged more than a sentence or 2 of actual conversation, though Gene has noticed, once or twice, that Harold seems to time his own departure to happen just before the doors lock, as though some private dignity required him to leave under his own power rather than be asked to. Around 8, a woman near the fountain grabs Gene's sleeve, more out of instinct than any clear sense of who he is, since he happens to be the nearest adult wearing something like a uniform, and asks if he has seen a boy in a red jacket. He has not, but he radios Frank on the handset clipped beside his belt loop, the 2 of them splitting the corridors between them, and within 10 minutes, Frank finds the boy exactly where boys of that age are always found, planted in front of the window at Aladdin's castle, watching someone else play Gallagher. The mother thanks Gene with the specific relief of a parent who has just stopped imagining the worst, and within a minute she has forgotten his face entirely, already steering her son back towards Sears. This is the sort of thing that never appears in any account of what a shopping mall was for. It was sold as a self-contained world safe enough to let a child wander a few storefronts ahead of a parent, and for the most part it was exactly that. But only because a small, uncredited network of people, guards and janitors and off-duty store clerks, quietly kept half an eye on every child in the building at all times. An entire invisible safety net that no shopper walking through Meadowbrook Galleria in 1986 would have known to thank. At 9 o'clock the mall's public address system crackles on, a recorded voice, warm and slightly too cheerful, announcing that Meadowbrook Galleria will be closing in 15 minutes and thanking everyone for shopping today. It is the same recording every single night, and Gene could recite it along with the speaker if he ever felt like it. This is the moment the whole texture of the building begins to change. Store managers start pulling metal accordion grates down over their entrances with a long rattling clatter that echoes up into the skylights. The arcade noise thins out as the last quarters run dry and the last teenagers get herded toward the exits by a manager tired of asking twice. Families move a little faster now, coats going back on, the crowd beginning to funnel itself toward the parking lot doors in twos and threes, and within 20 minutes, the corridor that was loud enough to require raised voices at 6 o'clock has gone almost entirely silent, holding only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the last recorded strains of the muzak, still playing to no one at all. The grates come down in a fixed order that never quite varies. The small independent shops go first, a jewelry kiosk here, a novelty t-shirt stand there, each proprietor eager to be first out the door. The chain stores follow a few minutes later, their managers moving with the practiced unhurriedness of employees whose closing bonus does not depend on speed. Sears and Higbee's, the two anchors, take longest of all, their doors staying open nearly to the last minute in case a straggler decides at 9:25 that tonight is finally the night to buy that space heater. Gene has watched this same sequence play out several thousand times over 5 years, and he has come to find something almost soothing in its total predictability, the way a person might find comfort in the changing of the guard outside a palace they will never actually visit. Gene stands near the fountain in center court and watches the doors lock, one by one, security pulling the big glass panels shut and turning keys that only 3 or 4 people in the whole building carry. The fountain keeps running for another few minutes out of habit before someone shuts it off for the night, and the sudden absence of its trickling water is its own small kind of silence landing on top of the larger one. This is the moment Gene's actual work begins. Everything before 9:30 was simply waiting for the building to empty itself out so that he could get to it. A commercial floor buffer in 1986 costs somewhere between $1,100 and $2,000, depending on the brand and the horsepower of the motor, and Diversified Building Services owns 4 of them. Rotated between Meadowbrook Galleria and the 2 office parks the company also services. The numbers are worth pausing over because they tell you something about who actually pays for the shine on a shopping mall floor, and how thinly that money gets spread by the time it reaches the man running the machine. The mall itself, according to the trade publications that developers pass around at their conventions, cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $35 to $40 a square foot to build back in 1971, which for a building of Meadowbrook's size worked out to several $1,000,000 before a single storefront had signed a lease. That money came from an insurance company out of Cleveland that financed the construction and now collects rent from every tenant inside, from Higbee's down to the smallest kiosk selling sunglasses near the food court. The janitorial contract is a much smaller line item in that whole arrangement, negotiated once a year between the mall's management office and Diversified Building Services, and it is priced, like most service contracts of this kind, as a fixed monthly fee rather than by the hour. Which means that every hour Gene spends fighting the floor buffer down Corridor A costs the mall itself nothing extra. It costs Diversified Building Services labor, and it costs Gene his back. That annual contract is awarded through a bidding process that repeats every December when Diversified Building Services and 2 or 3 competing janitorial firms each submit a sealed proposal to the mall's management office, listing exactly what they will charge to keep Meadowbrook Galleria clean for the coming year. The mall almost always accepts the lowest bid, provided the company can show it carries adequate insurance, and this single fact does more to determine Gene's wage than almost anything else in his working life. A contractor competing on price alone has exactly one lever available to lower its number without losing money outright. And that lever is labor. Diversified Building Services cannot easily reduce what it pays for wax or ammonia or the lease on its buffers, since those prices are set by suppliers with little reason to negotiate. It can, however, hold the line on wages. And it does, year after year, in a quiet arrangement nobody ever calls collusion, because it requires no conversation between the companies at all. Only the shared logic of an industry where undercutting on pay is simply how a contract gets won. Diversified Building Services' full annual contract with Meadowbrook Galleria runs to a little under $200,000, covering the wages of the entire night crew across all three of the mall's leased wings: the wax and ammonia and mop heads, the lease payments on the buffers, and a modest margin for the company itself. Spread across 365 nights a year, that works out to something under $550 a night to keep an entire enclosed shopping mall looking, every single morning, as though it required no maintenance whatsoever. It is, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary amount of illusion purchased for a fairly small sum, and almost none of that sum, once the company takes its margin and the equipment its lease, ever reaches the hands of the people actually producing it. This is the part of the arrangement that most shoppers walking through the mall in daylight have never once thought about, because there is no reason they would. A contracted service, by design, disappears into the background of a business the way the buffer disappears into the tile it polishes. Meadowbrook Galleria's own annual report, if such a mall kept one, would list janitorial services as an operating expense somewhere below insurance and above landscaping. A single-dollar figure with no names attached to it at all. Gene Ostrowski does not appear anywhere in the financial life of the building he keeps running. He is a cost, allocated and paid and forgotten, the way the electricity is a cost, the way the fountain's water bill is a cost. The wages tell their own quiet story too. Gene makes $6 an hour as crew lead, which sounds almost generous next to the federal minimum of $3.35, until you set it beside what he made at Goodrich only a handful of years earlier. A rubber worker with Gene's seniority was earning something close to $11 or $12 an hour by the time the plant cut his department loose in 1981, plus a pension plan and health coverage negotiated by the United Rubber Workers Union that had represented Akron's tire industry for generations. The job Gene has now offers neither. Diversified Building Services provides no pension. Health coverage, when it exists at all for a crew like Gene's, comes as a bare-bones plan with a deductible steep enough that most of the men simply avoid the doctor unless something is seriously wrong. This is not a story unique to Akron, or to Ohio, or even to the rubber industry specifically. Across the industrial Midwest, through the late 70s and into the 80s, a whole generation of men found the factory floor replaced by the retail floor, the union wage replaced by the contracted hourly rate, and nobody in charge of the transition ever quite framed it as a demotion, though for men like Gene it plainly was one. For a point of comparison, a department manager at Higbee's, salaried rather than hourly, earns something in the neighborhood of $18,000 a year in 1986, a figure that works out to roughly $9 an hour across a standard work year, plus a discount on merchandise and a health plan considerably better than anything Diversified Building Services can offer its crews. That manager and Gene often stand within 30 feet of each other on any given evening, one behind a cash register under bright light, the other behind a floor buffer in a dimmer corridor an hour later. And the gap between their two positions, in pay and in standing alike, has very little to do with the difficulty of either job, and a great deal to do with which side of the tenant and vendor line each of them happens to stand on. Twice a year, in a job that falls outside Gene's usual nightly routine entirely, Diversified Building Services sends an additional 4-man crew to strip the accumulated old wax off every inch of Meadowbrook's terrazzo and reapply a fresh coat from the bare tile up, a process that takes 3 full overnight shifts and costs the mall itself several $1,000s each time it happens. Gene has worked this job more times than he can easily count, on his hands and knees with a stripping pad in sections too tight for the machine to reach, and he has come, over the years, to understand it as the closest thing his work has to a visible achievement. A floor that goes from dull and yellowed to fully gleaming under his own hands over the course of a single long weekend. Evidence, for once, of exactly how much labor a shine like that actually requires. There is more to understand here about who actually profits from a shopping mall's gleam. The teenager working retail at the Gap for $3.35 an hour and the crew lead running the Buffer for $6 an hour are, from the perspective of the mall's balance sheet, simply two different flavors of the same thing. Cheap labor that keeps the building looking like it requires no labor at all. The specialty stores marking up a pair of Jordache jeans to nearly $40 can absorb minimum wage retail staff easily, because the margin on fashion goods is enormous compared to the margin on cleaning services, which is precisely why the mall contracts its cleaning out rather than hiring Gene directly. A contractor can be squeezed on price in a way that a mall's own payroll, with its benefits and its legal protections, cannot be squeezed nearly as easily. Diversified Building Services wins the annual bid by promising the lowest number, and it keeps that number low the only way a company like it can, by paying men like Gene as little as the labor market will bear. None of this makes Gene bitter, or at least he has never let it show if it does. He has told Denise on more than one of their Sunday phone calls that a job is a job, and that he is grateful for one that lets him keep his own apartment and keep money moving toward her tuition each semester. But the arithmetic is worth sitting with for a moment before we go back to watching him work, because it explains something essential about the polished, gleaming, effortless feeling that a mall like Meadowbrook Galleria was built to produce. That gleam is not free. It is simply priced in a way that keeps its true cost as invisible as the man who produces it every single night. Walking backward down a corridor nobody else will see him clean, a winter coat off the rack at Sears that season, the same kind Gene helped wheel back to the receiving dock earlier that evening. Retails for around $45. A price that assumes, implicitly, a customer earning something closer to the era's median household income of roughly $24,000 a year rather than the $6 an hour Gene is paid to keep the floor beneath that rack clean. He has never once bought a coat from inside Meadowbrook Galleria himself. His own coat, the flannel-lined one he wears on the drive-in every night, came from a Goodwill on the other side of Barberton, a fact he has never found any real reason to feel embarrassed about, though it says something quietly precise about who a mall like this one was actually built to serve. It is 10:15, and Gene wheels the Buffer out of the supply closet near Sears and begins the part of the night that will occupy most of his shoulders and his lower back for the next 4 hours. The machine itself is a heavy thing, close to 100 pounds, built around a single wide rotating brush beneath a motor housing that vibrates hard enough to numb your palms if you grip the handles too tightly. Gene has learned, the way every experienced operator learns, that fighting the Buffer head-on is a losing proposition. The trick is to let the machine's own rotation do the work of turning it, guiding it gently left and right in a rhythm that feels almost like leading a dance partner who outweighs you by 70 pounds and does not especially want to be led. He flips the switch and the motor kicks up into a steady whine, and the smell rises immediately. The specific chemical sweetness of industrial floor wax mixing with a lingering trace of ammonia from the cleaner Thelma used earlier on the food court tables, and somewhere underneath both of them, never quite gone, the smell of stale grease that has soaked into the tile grout near the pizza counter over 15 years of dinner rushes. He starts the Buffer at one end of corridor A and begins walking it backward, slow, steady steps, watching the tile ahead of him for scuff marks left by the day's sneakers and boots, guiding the machine in wide arcs so that each pass overlaps the last by a few inches. Walking backward down a corridor for 4 hours sounds, described plainly, almost meditative, and there are nights when it is exactly that. Tonight, in a building this quiet, Gene can hear his own heartbeat if he lets his mind settle into the rhythm of the machine. The whine of the motor and the soft repeated slap of the brush against tile becoming the only sound in a corridor built to hold the noise of thousands. The storefronts on either side of him stand behind their metal grates, dark, their window displays lit only by the corridor's own overhead fluorescents, mannequins frozen mid-gesture in outfits nobody will admire again until morning. It is, Gene has decided over the years, one of the stranger sensations available to a person in the 20th century, to be entirely alone inside a building engineered for crowds. The buffer itself is a tenant, a brand every commercial cleaner in the Midwest would recognize on sight. Its pads sold in cases of a dozen from the same Cleveland distributor that supplies the degreaser. And changing one of those pads mid-shift, when a section of tile proves stubborn enough to wear one through early, costs Gene nearly 10 minutes of unclipping and reclipping, a mechanism that always seems to fight him harder at 2 in the morning than it ever does during a daytime training session. Once a month, a technician from an elevator and escalator service company spends a night running diagnostic checks on the 2 escalators flanking center court, a job separate entirely from Gene's own contract. And on those nights, Gene works around a rope barrier and the smell of machine grease rising up from the escalator's open access panel. One more reminder that an enclosed mall is, underneath its carpet and its terrazzo, an enormous machine with dozens of separate contractors quietly keeping different parts of it alive. Twice tonight already the buffer has caught on the raised edge of a floor mat outside the footlocker, jerking hard enough to nearly pull Gene off balance both times. And both times he has caught it the same way, bracing his weight backward through his heels and absorbing the jolt through his forearms rather than his spine, a reflex 5 years in the making that a newer man on the crew would not yet have. Marcus took a bad jolt like that during his first month, the machine catching and swinging into a storefront gate hard enough to bruise his hip, and Gene has never forgotten the sound of it. A hollow metallic bang that echoed the length of the whole corridor at 2 in the morning, more startling for how completely alone the two of them were when it happened. By midnight, his lower back has begun its familiar complaint, a dull ache low across the spine that comes from bracing against the buffer's pull for hours at a stretch, and his forearms carry a low, steady burn that he has stopped noticing until he sets the machine down for a break. This is the part of the job nobody watching him from the mall's marketing brochure would ever think to include. The brochure shows a gleaming corridor and calls it a feature of shopping at Meadowbrook Galleria. It does not show the shoulder that has to absorb the machine's vibration to produce that gleam, night after night, for years. He takes his half hour at midnight on a bench near the darkened entrance to Higby's, and most nights he is joined there by Frank Del Vecchio, the overnight security guard, a retired Akron police officer in his late 50s who took the mall job for something to do with his hands and his 8-hour blocks of night, now that his own children are grown. Frank carries a thermos of coffee large enough for 2, an arrangement the two of them settled into wordlessly sometime during Gene's 2nd year on the job, and they sit together most nights without saying a great deal, watching the dark shape of the fountain across the empty court and listening to whichever ball game is playing low on Gene's radio. Tonight it is an off-season call-in show, men arguing about whether the Browns will finally get past Denver this coming January, and Frank offers an opinion on it every few minutes while Gene mostly listens, nodding at the parts he agrees with. Some nights Frank talks instead about his 26 years on the Akron police force, mostly patrol, a few of them working nights downtown before downtown Akron had much left in it worth patrolling. He tells these stories the way a man tells stories he has already told 100 times, worn smooth at the edges, no longer really about the events themselves so much as about the comfort of saying them out loud to somebody who will not interrupt. Gene has heard the one about the Christmas Eve he spent talking a teenager down from the roof of the old Ohio building probably a dozen times over 5 years, and he has never once told Frank he has heard it before, because some other nights it is Gene doing the repeating. About Goodrich, about Carol, about a fishing trip to Portage Lakes that gets a little more perfect in the retelling every single time. There is a particular kind of camaraderie that grows between the handful of people who work a building like this after midnight, something quieter and less performed than ordinary workplace friendship, built less on conversation than on simple, reliable presence. Frank walks his rounds past Corridor A every hour or so and nods at Gene without breaking stride. And Gene has come to find that nod as reassuring in its small way, as anything Carol used to say to him across the breakfast table. Thelma passes through Centre Court with her mop bucket around 1 in the morning and raises a hand the same way she did at 6 o'clock. And Marcus, when his own break lines up with theirs, sits on the far end of the bench and complains cheerfully about his community college algebra class while eating a sandwich his mother packed him. It is not much of a social life measured against what any of these people might have had in another line of work at another hour. But it is real, and it repeats itself with enough consistency that Gene has come to depend on it the way a person depends on weather. Here, now, is where most people get the actual experience of this job wrong. They picture mopping a floor as something close to mindless, an activity that occupies the hands while the mind wanders free, and for some of the lighter tasks that description is not entirely unfair. But running an industrial buffer for 4 straight hours down a corridor several hundred feet long requires a steady, active attention that never quite lets go, a constant small correction of grip and stance to keep a heavy machine from either stalling out or dragging you sideways into a storefront gate. Gene finishes most nights with his shirt genuinely soaked through despite the mall's air conditioning, his hands faintly numb from the vibration, and a fatigue in his shoulders that has nothing meditative left in it by 4 in the morning. The peaceful, dreamlike quality of an empty mall at night is real. It simply coexists, the way most true things do, with a body doing real and tiring labor to produce it. After his break, he moves into the food court itself, where Thelma has already scraped down the tables and chairs, and Gene runs the smaller buffer attachment across the tile near the fry stations, working the degreaser into the grout with slow overlapping passes to lift the last of the day's grease before it can set into something permanent. The food court at 1:30 in the morning is its own small, strange world. Rows of empty tables under the great skylight, the neon signage of Orange Julius and Sparrow, and a Chinese food counter called Panda Pavilion, all still glowing faintly on their timers, even though there is nobody left to read them. Gene works his way past all of it, checking the trash cans Marcus already emptied, wiping down the counter of the pretzel stand where a manager left a light film of cinnamon sugar dusted across the surface. And by 2 in the morning, the food court smells only of ammonia and cooling wax, the fried food scent finally beaten back for one more night. The degreaser he uses on the food court tile comes in 5-gallon buckets shipped from a chemical supplier in Cleveland, industrial strength enough that Diversified Building Services requires its crews to wear rubber gloves handling it undiluted, and the smell of it, sharp and faintly citrus underneath the harshness, is one Gene stopped noticing consciously years ago. The way a person stops noticing their own house. Thelma taught him, back when he first started, exactly how long to let it sit on the grout before working it in with a stiff bristle brush, a small trade secret passed from one night worker to the next, the same way any craft knowledge gets handed along, informally, without a manual, over the course of an ordinary shift. Marcus finishes his own tasks a little after 2 and stops by Corridor A on his way to the break room. Still moving at something close to a jog even this deep into the shift, because he has an 8 o'clock algebra class at the community college in a few hours, and has learned, through hard experience, that arriving late costs him more sleep than arriving on time ever would. Gene tells him, as he tells him most nights, to get some rest before class, and Marcus laughs and says he will, in the specific tone of a 20-year-old with no intention of doing any such thing, before jogging off toward the break room to eat something ahead of his own shift ending at 3. A delivery driver lets himself in through the loading dock around 1 in the morning with the week's new releases for the record store. A routine Gene has grown used to nodding through without much comment, watching a dolly stacked with cardboard boxes of vinyl and cassette tapes roll past him on its way to a locked storeroom nobody will open again until 9 the next morning. The driver mentions, most weeks, whatever new album is inside the boxes, and Gene has picked up, almost against his will, a working knowledge of the current music charts simply from these brief exchanges at 1 in the morning. a small, unplanned education he would never otherwise have sought out. Somewhere around 1:45, a song comes on that Carol used to like. An old Patsy Cline number the call-in show's host plays as a bumper heading into a commercial break, and Gene finds himself humming the first few bars without quite deciding to, the buffer's whine nearly swallowing the sound entirely. He does not think of this as a sad moment. Exactly, it is simply one of the small unplanned currents that run through a long quiet shift, grief and habit, and something close to comfort arriving together and passing again just as quickly, the way most private feelings do when there is a corridor still left to finish. He checks both sets of public restrooms at 2:15, restocks the paper towels near the arcade entrance, and on his way back through Centre Court he stops, as he does most nights, to check the soil in the big ficus planters near the fountain, less because it is his job than because he has developed, over 5 years, something close to an attachment to them. A small green fact of continuity in a building that otherwise resets itself completely every 24 hours. The landscaping contractor comes twice a week to water and prune, but Gene checks anyway, out of the same habit that has him double-checking every storefront gate whether or not anyone asked him to. By 2:30 he is back on Corridor A, finishing the last 100 feet of tile that the buffer had not yet reached. His radio has moved on to a weather report, calling for lake-effect snow later in the week, and Gene registers it the way a farmer registers a forecast, a fact worth filing away for tomorrow's drive without much feeling attached to it tonight. There is still half the corridor and the whole of Corridor B ahead of him before the sun comes up, and the night. If you can call 3 in the morning the middle of anything, still has a long way left to go. Before we follow Gene into the second half of this night, there is something worth understanding about what a schedule like his actually does to a body and a place in the world. Nobody in 1986 is using the phrase circadian rhythm at the dinner table, but the science behind it already exists, tucked away in medical journals that a man like Gene would never have reason to read. Researchers studying shift workers through the 70s and 80s had already established that a body kept awake through the night and asleep through the day pays a real physical price for the arrangement, disrupted digestion, elevated risk of heart trouble over the long run, a sleep that never quite reaches the depth of sleep taken after dark the way nature intended it. None of this had made its way into any regulation protecting a man like Gene. There was no law in Ohio in 1986 requiring diversified building services to offer night differential pay beyond what the contract already specified, no requirement for extra rest breaks, no health screening for the men and women whose hours ran backward against the sun. The science existed. The protection did not, and would not for a long while yet. The Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration had existed since 1971, and it did meaningful work reducing the kind of catastrophic injuries that used to maim assembly line workers by the thousands at plants exactly like Gene's old one at Goodrich. But its authority was built almost entirely around specific, visible hazards, unguarded machinery, toxic fume exposure, faulty wiring, rather than the slower, cumulative wear of a repetitive task performed for years on end, or the quieter physiological cost of working against the body's own clock. A regulator inspecting Meadowbrook Galleria's back corridors in 1986 would have found little to cite. The buffer was properly grounded. The chemicals were properly labelled. Nothing about Gene's job would have registered on any government inspection form as dangerous, even though 5 more years of it would leave his lower back permanently changed in ways no single inspection was ever designed to catch. The physical toll of the work itself was just as real and just as unrecorded. A floor buffer operator develops, over years, a distinct pattern of strain across the lower back and shoulders that a doctor examining an X-ray might recognize on sight without ever being told the man's occupation. Workers' compensation claims for repetitive strain injuries existed on the books, but a contracted janitorial employee moving between one company's payroll and the next as contracts changed hands often had a thinner paper trail behind him than a factory employee with 20 years at a single plant. Gene has never filed a claim of any kind. He has simply adjusted the way men of his generation tended to adjust, taking aspirin before a long shift and stretching his back against the loading dock wall before he starts the buffer, treating the ache as a fact of the job rather than a problem with a name. There is a social hierarchy at play here too, quieter than any org chart but every bit as real. Inside Meadowbrook Galleria, a retail employee at Higbee's, wearing the store's own uniform and reporting to the store's own manager, occupies a different social position than a contracted janitorial worker wearing diversified building services on his coveralls. Even though both of them, in Gene's case, are being paid close to the same hourly wage. The retail employee belongs to the mall in a way the contract worker does not. She gets an employee discount. She gets invited, at least nominally, to the mall's holiday party for tenant staff each December. Gene and Thelma and Marcus do not appear on any tenant staff list at all, because Diversified Building Services is a vendor, not a tenant, and the distinction, invisible to any shopper walking past, determines who gets a party invitation and who does not. Thelma's position inside this hierarchy carries its own distinct weight. She is doing exactly the same physical work as Gene and Marcus, mopping and scrubbing and hauling trash through an 8-hour shift. But she is doing it as a 61-year-old woman in an industry that, through the 1980s, still assumes its physically demanding jobs belong by default to men. And she has told Gene, on the rare occasions she talks about it at all, that more than one daytime manager over the years has addressed every instruction to Gene first, as though a woman running a mop bucket could not possibly also be the one who knows where the circuit breaker for the food court lighting is actually located. Contracted janitorial work of this kind across the country through the 1980s drew disproportionately from two overlapping populations: displaced industrial workers like Gene in the Rust Belt cities where factories were closing, and recent immigrants in the larger metropolitan areas where contracting firms could always find someone willing to work the least desirable hours for the lowest posted wage. Meadowbrook Galleria's crew happens to be mostly the first kind, a consequence of Akron's own economic collapse in these years rather than any deliberate hiring pattern, but Diversified Building Services contracts in Cleveland proper. Gene has heard secondhand, lean heavily on workers from Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, men and women for whom English is a second language, and a night shift with minimal supervision is, in its own way, easier to navigate than a customer-facing day job would be. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told about the American service economy taking shape through the 1980s. As factories across the industrial Midwest cut their payrolls, the men who lost those jobs moved in enormous numbers into exactly this kind of contracted, subcontracted, arm's-length employment. Work that looked from a distance like the same category as a factory job. Showing up, punching a clock, doing physical labor, but that carried none of the legal or social weight a union shop once carried. A man could go from being represented by the United Rubber Workers with grievance procedures and negotiated raises and a pension fund behind him to being one interchangeable name on a contractor's roster, replaceable within a week if he asked for too much. Gene has never once framed his own life in these terms out loud. He simply notices, some nights, that Frank the security guard, a retired police officer with his own pension already secured, treats the job as a pleasant way to fill his evenings, while Gene treats the same building, the same hours, as the entire remaining structure of his working life. There is no employee recognition program at Diversified Building Services, no plaque anywhere acknowledging 5 years of service, no mechanism at all for the company to note that Gene Ostrowski has kept Corridor A gleaming every Monday and Thursday night for half a decade running. Turnover in the industry nationally runs high, often exceeding half the workforce inside a single year. And a company competing on the thinnest possible margin has little financial incentive to invest in retaining anyone, since a new hire costs almost nothing to train for tasks this repetitive. Gene has simply outlasted the churn around him. the way a fence post outlasts a field. Not through any real recognition of his value, but through a kind of stubborn continuity that nobody above him has ever had reason to notice, let alone reward. Diversified Building Services offers no formal safety training beyond a single afternoon of orientation when a worker is first hired. Mostly a supervisor demonstrating how to lock out the trash compactor before reaching inside it, and a brief warning about mixing ammonia with the wrong kind of degreaser. Everything else, the correct way to brace against a buffer's pull, the proper technique for lifting a fully loaded trash bag without straining the lower back, gets passed down informally, worker to worker, the same way Thelma taught Gene how long to let the degreaser sit on the grout. This works well enough most of the time, since the men and women doing the teaching have every incentive to protect the ones learning from them, but it leaves no paper trail, no documented standard, nothing a regulator or a lawyer could later point to as evidence that anyone had been properly trained at all. Marcus, at 20, worries Gene in a specific way that Thelma and Frank, both older and further along in their working lives, do not. He is running on the same 5 hours of sleep most days that Gene ran on decades ago in his own early 20s. Except Marcus is doing it while also carrying a full course load, and Gene has watched enough young men wear themselves down chasing exactly this kind of double life to recognize the specific grey look Marcus sometimes gets around 4 in the morning, the look of a body being asked to do more than any single body is really built to do. He has never told Marcus to slow down. He has only, once or twice, quietly taken on part of Marcus's restroom check himself on a night when the boy looked especially worn through, without ever mentioning that he had done it. Health coverage, when Diversified Building Services offers it at all, comes with a deductible steep enough that Gene has been putting off a dentist appointment for the better part of a year. A small back molar that aches when he drinks anything cold. He mentioned it to Denise once, in passing, and she told him, with the specific firmness of a daughter halfway through nursing school, that he needed to get it looked at before it became something worse and more expensive. He agreed with her. The way a person agrees with an obviously correct point they still have no immediate intention of acting on, and the appointment remains unmade. This is not a dramatic hardship. It is a small, ordinary, extremely common one, repeated across a great many households very much like his, and it is exactly the kind of detail that a glossy photograph of a shopping mall at Christmas would never think to include. None of this touches the part of Gene's life that still feels, by his own account, genuinely good. He likes the quiet. He likes Frank's company and Thelma's silent competence and the quiet satisfaction of a corridor gleaming under fluorescent light at 3 in the morning because his own 2 hands made it gleam. But it is worth sitting with, for a moment, the invisible architecture of who is protected and who is not inside a building built to look effortless, before we go back and watch him finish the night. It is 3 in the morning now, the hour Gene has always privately considered the true center of the night, and he stands for a moment at the edge of center court, simply looking at the building he has spent the last 9 hours cleaning. The escalators are switched off, their steps frozen mid-climb in a way that always strikes Gene as slightly unnatural, a staircase that should be moving and is not. The fountain has been dark and dry of motion since 9:30, its tiled basin holding a few inches of still water under the skylight, and without its usual trickle the whole court has a hush to it that feels almost architectural, as if silence was something the building itself was designed to produce once the crowds went home. The grates were down over every storefront, and the mannequins stood frozen behind glass in poses meant for daytime shoppers who would not see them again for another 6 hours, and the corridors stretched away in both directions under identical rows of fluorescent light, empty all the way to the anchor stores at either end. A person could stand in the exact center of Meadowbrook Galleria at this hour and see in every direction evidence of a building meant to hold 10,000 human beings, currently holding 4. The building has its own private orchestra at this hour, one the daytime crowd never gets to hear beneath the muzak and the arcade noise and the general roar of several thousand people existing in the same enclosed space at once. There is the low, continuous hum of the air handling system somewhere above the ceiling tile, and there is the occasional tick of the building settling against the cold pressing in from outside, and there is the far-off clatter of an ice machine cycling on inside the food court, and there is, every so often, nothing at all. A silence so complete that Gene can hear the specific whine of his own hearing, the sound a body makes when it has simply run out of anything else to listen to. There is a particular psychological weight to being that alone inside a structure built at that scale, and Gene felt it sharply in his first few months on the job. 5 years ago, before the feeling settled into something closer to comfort than unease. He remembers standing in almost this exact spot during his second week, badge still stiff and new on his coveralls, feeling something close to a held breath every time his own footsteps echoed back at him off the tile. As if the building itself were listening, it faded, the way most fears fade with familiarity, and what replaced it for Gene was something closer to ownership. He is not trespassing here. He belongs to these hours in a way none of the daytime shoppers ever will, and there is a strange, quiet pride in knowing every dark corner of a building that 10,000 strangers believe runs itself. Passing a darkened storefront window near the record store, Gene catches his own reflection for a moment. Grey coveralls and grey hair under fluorescent light, superimposed faintly over a display of stereo equipment nobody will buy for another 6 hours. And there is something oddly moving in seeing himself laid, however briefly, over that exact arrangement of merchandise. As though for 1 second he belonged to the display itself rather than to the corridor in front of it. In the window of a small bridal shop near Higby's, 3 mannequins stand frozen in white gowns nobody has purchased yet, their painted faces caught in identical serene half-smiles under a spotlight left burning all night on a separate timer from the rest of the store. And Gene has always found something quietly touching in walking past them at this hour. 3 brides waiting alone in the dark for a wedding that exists, for now, only as a possibility on a rack. Frank's flashlight beam sweeps ahead of him in the darker stretch of Corridor B near the movie theatre, where half the overhead fluorescents are switched off after hours to save on the electric bill, and Gene has come to find the specific yellow wobble of that beam moving steadily through the dark 30 yards ahead of him. One of the more reassuring sights available inside the building at this hour, proof that another human being is awake and moving through the same silence he is. Near the mall's administrative office, behind a locked door neither Gene nor Frank has a key to, a bank of black and white security monitors keeps its own silent watch over the parking lot and the 2 main entrances, feeding into a videotape recorder that a day manager will rewind and review only if something goes missing overnight. Frank checks the small green light on the recorder through the door's window glass each time he passes, a habit as automatic to him as Gene's habit of checking storefront gates. 2 men each keeping half an eye on a system neither one of them was ever quite trained to operate, simply because somebody in the building ought to. He finds Frank near the Higby's entrance again, working through the last of his rounds before the morning managers start arriving, and the 2 of them stand together for a few minutes in the dark of the department store's darkened window display, watching a mannequin family arranged around a fake Christmas tree that Higby's put up early, the way department stores always did, weeks before Thanksgiving had even arrived. Frank mentions that his grandson turned 6 last week, that his daughter sent photographs from the birthday party, a cake shaped like a fire truck. Gene tells him, in turn, that Denise called Sunday and sounded tired from her clinical rotations and that he is thinking about driving up to see her before her exams start next month. Frank asks, as he does every year around this time, whether Gene has given any more thought to retiring somewhere warmer once Denise finishes school, Florida maybe, or one of the Carolinas, and Gene gives the same answer he always gives, that Barberton is where Carol is buried and where his whole life happened, and that a man his age does not generally start over in a state he has never once visited. Frank nods at this the way he nods at most things Gene says, without pushing, and mentions instead that his own daughter has been asking whether he might finally hang up the uniform now that his pension has fully vested. A question Frank has so far managed to avoid answering directly for the better part of 2 years. It is a small exchange, the kind two men might have anywhere at any hour. Except that this one takes place inside a building 3,000 miles of tile wide with nobody else awake to overhear it, and there is something in that setting, Gene has always felt, that makes the words land a little more gently than they might in a crowded room. By 3:30 he is finishing the last stretch of Corridor B, walking the buffer backward past the entrance to a record store, past a shop selling only greeting cards, past the darkened arcade where the machines sit silent under their own glowing marquee lights, Pac-Man and Gallagher and Dragon's Lair all waiting patiently for the quarters that will not arrive again until noon. The buffer's hum is, at this hour, close to the only sound in the entire wing of the mall. And Gene lets his mind wander the way it tends to at 3:30 in the morning, back toward Carol. Toward the way she used to leave the porch light on for him, even after 22 years of marriage had made his late shifts at Goodrich entirely routine. Toward a version of his life that ended and a version that began after it, both of them, in their own way, built around waiting for someone to come home. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely, if you let it. The teenagers who spent their Thursday afternoon in this exact corridor, flirting near the record store, feeding quarters into the arcade, would never in 100 guesses imagine that the building goes quiet enough at 3 in the morning for a 50-year-old man's grief to have room to breathe in it. They knew the mall as noise and crowd and neon, a place built entirely for the daylight version of itself. Gene knows it as the other thing. The version that exists after the daylight version has gone home to bed. And it is worth understanding that both versions are equally real, running on the same tile, sharing the same walls, taking turns. He passes the darkened lobby of the 6-screen theatre a little after 3:30, the popcorn machine switched off and empty, the marquee out front unlit until the first matinee crew arrives around 10. And for a moment, the whole lobby holds the specific stillness of a stage after the actors have gone home, the velvet ropes still in their brass stanchions, guiding a crowd that will not exist again for hours. Gene has never once gone inside to watch a film, despite 5 years of walking past that lobby several times a night. It has never occurred to him as strange until just this moment that he maintains a place of entertainment for thousands of people without ever once, himself, being entertained by it. A thin skin of condensation has formed on the inside of the loading dock's small window, the cold outside pressing hard enough against the mall's engineered warmth to leave its mark even through insulated glass. And Gene wipes a clear circle in it with his sleeve out of pure habit, checking the parking lot for headlights the way a ship's watch checks the horizon, though there has never once in 5 years been anything out there worth watching for. Very faintly, if the building's own hum drops low enough between the air handler's cycles, he can sometimes hear the hiss of tires on the county road a quarter-mile off, a single set of headlights passing through the dark at some hour that has nothing to do with shopping at all. A trucker most likely, or a shift worker like himself headed somewhere else entirely, and the sound of it, thin and far away, is the closest thing the deep night offers to a reminder that the whole rest of the world has not actually gone entirely still. He empties the last of the trash compactor near the loading dock around 4, hauling the heavy bags out through the same service door he badged through at 6 the previous evening, and the cold outside air hits him for a moment like a small shock. A reminder that an actual November night has been happening this whole time on the other side of the mall's climate-controlled walls. He can see his breath under the loading dock's single security light. Somewhere beyond the parking lot, a set of headlights moves along the county road, the first sign in hours of a world that has anywhere else for people to be. Gene stands there a little longer than usual tonight, watching his own breath fog under the single security light, thinking, not for the first time. that the mall's whole engineered climate exists specifically to make a person forget that a night like this one, in actual November, in actual Ohio, is cold enough to ache in the fingers within a minute or two of bare exposure. Carol used to complain about exactly this kind of cold every winter of their marriage, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee watching the thermometer nailed outside the glass, and Gene finds that some part of him still checks for a thermometer that is no longer there every time the air outside a doorway bites at him like this. He stands there for perhaps 30 seconds longer than the task requires, simply breathing the actual outdoor air, before heading back inside to the artificial spring that Victor Gruen designed 60 years ago to erase this exact feeling. By 4:30, the last of his major tasks are done, the corridors gleaming under their fluorescent lights. The food court smelling only of ammonia and cooling wax, the restrooms checked and restocked. And Gene allows himself a slower final walk through the building, clipboard tucked under one arm, radio down low, checking every storefront gate one more time the way he has for 5 years, whether or not anyone ever asked him to. The building is his, for one more hour, entirely and completely his, before the first grey edge of morning starts finding its way through the skylights over the food court and the whole cycle begins turning back toward the crowd. This is one of those moments where a quiet building at 4 in the morning tells you more about the coming decades than the crowded one at 4 in the afternoon ever could. Meadowbrook Galleria, in the autumn of 1986, sits at what turned out to be very close to the high watermark of the enclosed shopping mall as the dominant form of American retail. Nobody working inside it that November, Gene included, had any reason to suspect this. The mall had been the future for 15 years running, the format every developer in the country was still building toward, and by most measures the industry was still growing, with hundreds of new enclosed malls having opened across the country through the late 70s and early 80s. But underneath that surface of expansion, a handful of changes were already gathering that would over the following 2 decades quietly rewrite the whole picture. The most immediate of these was happening a few miles down the interstate, where a discount retailer built around enormous warehouse-style stores and rock-bottom prices was expanding at a pace that had already begun worrying analysts who studied the retail trade. Sam Walton had been opening Walmart stores across the rural South and Midwest since 1962, but through the 1980s, the company's growth accelerated sharply, and warehouse club chains like Sam's Club and Costco, both founded within a few years of this very night, were building an entirely different model of shopping around bulk goods and no-frills buildings. These stores offered almost none of what made a place like Meadowbrook Galleria culturally significant. There was no food court, no arcade, no place for a teenager to spend an idle Thursday afternoon, but they offered lower prices on exactly the kind of everyday goods that a Sears or a JCPenney had always relied on for steady traffic. And that quiet undercutting, invisible from inside the mall's own bright corridors, was the first thread in a pattern that would eventually unravel a great deal of what Meadowbrook represented. A related pressure was building around a new kind of specialty store that industry analysts had begun calling a category killer. An enormous single-purpose retailer devoted entirely to one type of merchandise, priced aggressively enough to undercut the smaller specialty shops that filled malls like Meadowbrook by the dozen. Toys R Us had been expanding this exact model since the 1960s, and through the 1980s, a wave of imitators followed in electronics and home improvement and office supplies, building enormous freestanding stores with their own parking lots that would, within a decade or two, make the phrase toy store or record store feel almost quaint. None of these stores existed inside Meadowbrook Galleria, and none of the mall's own specialty shops selling toys or electronics in smaller format had any real answer to a competitor that could stock 10 times the selection at a lower price under a single roof. There is a particular irony worth noting in the fact that Sears itself, anchoring one end of Meadowbrook Galleria, had built its entire 19th and early 20th century fortune on a mail-order catalogue that let rural Americans shop from their own kitchen tables without ever visiting a store at all. a business the company had let dwindle for decades as retail stores like this one became the more profitable side of the operation. The same basic idea, buying without leaving the house, was quietly reassembling itself in 1986 through cable shopping channels and mail-order catalogues of a newer kind, and within a handful of years, Sears would shutter its print catalogue altogether, having decided the future belonged entirely to the stores it had once treated as a sideline. The wheel, it turned out, was simply turning back toward where it had already been. There was a second shift happening even closer to home, inside American households themselves. The two-income family, still a relatively new and much-discussed arrangement in 1986, was changing the rhythm of American shopping in ways that would only become obvious with hindsight. When both parents in a household worked full-time, the leisurely weekday shopping trip that had once filled a homemaker's morning became a weekend errand instead, compressed and efficient, planned around a Saturday rather than wandered into on a Tuesday. Malls responded by extending their hours and by leaning harder into the food court and the movie theater. Anything that could turn an errand back into an outing worth lingering over. Meadowbrook's own food court, added in a renovation only 4 years before this night, was itself a direct answer to exactly this pressure. An admission that people needed a reason to stay if they were only going to show up once a week instead of 3 or 4 times. A third change, quieter still, was arriving through people's living rooms rather than through the parking lot. Home shopping networks selling merchandise directly over cable television had launched only the previous year, and video rental stores, still a fairly new fixture of the American strip mall landscape, were changing how families spent an evening that might once have meant a trip to the movie theater bolted onto Meadowbrook's East Wing. None of this technology had done any visible damage yet. The 6-screen theater at Meadowbrook still sold out its evening showings most Fridays. But the habit of staying home for entertainment that had once required leaving the house was forming, slowly, in millions of living rooms at once. And habits formed slowly are precisely the kind that no one notices changing until they have already changed completely. There is a broader pattern worth naming here too about what a shopping mall like Meadowbrook Galleria was quietly asked to become in the community built around it. Suburban development through the post-war decades had scattered American families across subdivisions with few sidewalks and fewer public squares, and the enclosed mall filled a gap that town planners had mostly stopped providing for, offering warmth, shelter, benches, and a place simply to be among other people without spending anything at all, which is exactly what the retirees walking its corridors each morning and the teenagers loitering by the arcade each afternoon were both doing, whether or not either group thought of it in those terms. A mall was never only a collection of stores. It was, for a great many Americans in towns like Barberton, the closest thing left to a town square, built and maintained by a private insurance company rather than by any government, open to the public only for as long as the public kept spending enough to justify the light bill. Security itself was beginning to change too, in ways that would only become fully visible in the following decade. Frank's job in 1986 still consists mostly of checking door locks and walking friendly rounds past darkened storefronts, a role closer to a night watchman than anything resembling a modern security force. Within a few years, as concerns grew nationally about large groups of unsupervised teenagers gathering at malls on weekend nights, some shopping centers around the country would begin experimenting with curfew policies requiring anyone under a certain age to be accompanied by an adult after a certain hour. An idea that would have struck Frank in 1986 as faintly ridiculous, given how much of his own job at Meadowbrook still consisted of gently encouraging bored 15-year-olds to go home to parents who were, more often than not, still awake themselves. Downtown Akron itself, only 12 miles from Meadowbrook Galleria, had spent the better part of these same 15 years hollowing out in almost exact proportion to the mall's own growth. Its old 5 and dimes and locally owned department stores closing one by one as the shopping habits of the region relocated wholesale to buildings just like this one. Gene remembers the South Main Street of his own childhood as a place genuinely crowded on a Saturday afternoon. Streetcars and shop windows and a downtown movie palace that could seat 2,000 people at once. And he has watched, across the same 5 years he has worked at Meadowbrook, storefronts on that same street sit empty for months at a stretch, their windows soaped over or simply left dark. A slower and quieter version of the same abandonment that would eventually come, in its turn, for buildings exactly like the one he spends his nights keeping so carefully clean. Thelma remembers that same downtown corridor from the other side of the counter, having spent 11 years ringing up sales at a 5 and dime 2 blocks from the movie palace Gene remembers. And she has told him, more than once, that she felt the exact same hollowing out from behind her own register that Gene felt from inside a rubber plant. 2 different kinds of livelihood emptied out by the same slow tide moving through the same small city. For Gene, all of this circles back, in its own roundabout way, to the plant that let him go in 1981. He has never framed it to himself in the language of economic transitions or retail formats. But he has lived through the same underlying current twice now. Once when Akron's factories gave way to service jobs like his own, and again, invisibly, as he polishes floors inside a format of retail already being quietly hollowed out by the discount warehouse and the cable shopping channel, even if neither he nor anyone else standing in the building tonight could yet see it happening. He is, without knowing it, cleaning up after one version of the American economy while an entirely different one assembles itself just outside the mall's climate-controlled walls. In parking lots and living rooms neither he nor Meadowbrook Galleria's own management has any reason yet to worry about. For Gene, none of this touched his life directly. Not yet. His work that night was the same work it had been for 5 years and would remain, largely unaltered, for a good while longer. But there is something worth sitting with in the fact that the building he polished so carefully every night, the one that felt in 1986 like the permanent and obvious future of American shopping, was already standing on ground that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shift. The children riding the escalators at Meadowbrook Galleria that Thursday afternoon, the same escalators sitting frozen and dark while Gene worked, would grow up to do a great deal of their shopping somewhere else entirely, in stores that had not yet been built, and eventually through machines that had not yet been invented. Denise herself, 23 and studying nursing 40 minutes away, would live to see the record store near the food court close, then the arcade, then, eventually, the mall itself, in the fullness of time, the way most things eventually do. The generation of children riding those escalators that Thursday afternoon, the ones whose parents were, for the most part, still comfortably employed in whatever had replaced the factories, would grow up mostly unaware that the mall itself had ever felt uncertain or temporary to the adults who built it. They would simply inherit a slightly different landscape than the one their own parents inherited. Fewer of the small independent shops that had briefly filled Meadowbrook's storefronts in its first years. More of the same handful of national chains repeating themselves in mall after mall, and eventually, though none of them could have guessed it that November, entire wings of buildings, just like this one standing dark and empty long before any of them reached Gene's current age. Casualties of exactly the forces gathering unnoticed on this ordinary Thursday night. None of these threads had yet fully announced themselves on this specific Thursday in 1986. Meadowbrook Galleria's parking lot was still full most Saturdays. Its food court still turned a healthy profit. Its record store still sold enough copies of whatever record was playing loudly enough to bleed into the corridor that nobody there had any reason to imagine a future without it. Change of this kind rarely announces itself. It simply accumulates. One warehouse club opening 20 minutes away. One catalogue quietly discontinued. One family deciding to rent a movie instead of driving out on a Friday night, until the accumulation is simply the new and unremarkable shape of things, and nobody can quite say when the old shape stopped being true. None of that had happened yet on this specific November night, And it is worth saying plainly that nobody standing in Meadowbrook Galleria at 4 in the morning in 1986 could have told you any of it was coming. The mall felt permanent, because most things feel permanent while you are still inside them. That is simply how the passage of time tends to work on the people living through it, and it is worth remembering as we step back now, one last time, from Gene's single night to ask what the whole of it adds up to. Step back far enough from any single night, and a life like Gene Ostrowski's starts to reveal patterns that no single hour of it would show you on its own. The first is the invisibility of labor, and it is the pattern that touches nearly everything else we have watched tonight. From the moment Gene put on his grey coveralls at 6 in the evening, the mall's own daytime crowd stopped registering him as a person at all, and that was not an accident of politeness or distraction. It was the uniform doing precisely what it was designed to do, marking Gene as part of the building's architecture rather than part of its human population. This is not unique to shopping malls or to the 1980s. It is closer to a permanent feature of any economy built on visible convenience, in which the people producing that convenience are quietly filed under the same mental category as the machinery, present, functional, and unremarked upon. Think of the specific moment near the arcade, hours before the doors even closed, when two teenagers stepping out of Spencer's Gifts parted around Gene the way water parts around a stone, their eyes sliding past his grey coveralls entirely, having registered him only as an obstacle to avoid rather than a person to greet. Multiply that single unremarked moment by every shopper who passed him that evening, and by every night before it, and you begin to see the scale of it. An entire working life spent mostly invisible to the very public that life is organized around serving. The second pattern is the economics of appearance, and we spent a good while with it earlier tonight when we looked at what a floor buffer costs against what Gene is paid to operate one. A shopping mall sells, more than any specific pair of jeans or slice of pizza, an atmosphere of effortless abundance. The sense that the gleam on the tile and the fullness of the shelves simply exist. The way weather exists, without anyone's back aching to produce them. That atmosphere has a real cost, and the cost is paid disproportionately by the people least visible in the building's own accounting, the contracted janitor rather than the salaried store manager, the retired police officer working nights for extra income rather than the executives who never set foot in the mall after dark at all. Appearance, it turns out, is one of the most expensive things a business can manufacture and one of the cheapest to actually staff. Remember the $200,000 annual contract spread across 365 nights, or the department manager at Higbee's earning $9 an hour with a health plan, while Gene earns $6 with none at all, standing sometimes within 30 feet of each other on the very same evening. The gleam costs something specific and calculable every single night, and the calculation nearly always resolves the same way, weighted toward whoever stands furthest from the customer-facing side of the register. The third pattern is the way relationships form differently when they are built entirely inside the off hours that most of society has agreed to sleep through. Gene's friendship with Frank Del Vecchio, if you can even call it something as formal as a friendship, exists almost entirely inside a building after its doors have locked, sustained by a shared thermos and a nod exchanged on an hourly round, rather than by dinners or phone calls or the ordinary architecture of adult friendship. There is something quietly moving about this, a bond built out of nothing but consistency and proximity. Two men keeping each other company through hours the rest of the world has simply opted out of. It asks for very little, and it gives back, night after night, something that functions very much like companionship, even if neither man would ever describe it in those words. Harold, on his bench near the fountain most evenings, belongs to a gentler version of this same pattern. A man who has found, in the simple presence of strangers passing by, something that functions as company even without a single actual conversation to show for it. The fourth pattern is the gap between what a job requires and what a job is permitted to be seen doing. Gene's actual labor, the strength required to control a 100-pound machine for 4 straight hours, the attention required to catch every scuff mark before the morning crowd arrives, the sheer physical toll accumulating quietly in his shoulders and his spine has to remain completely undetectable in its results. Success in Gene's line of work is defined entirely by the absence of evidence that anyone worked at all. A surgeon's skill is visible in the outcome. A teacher's skill shows itself in a student who learns something. Gene's skill shows itself only in a corridor that looks, to anyone walking through it at 9 the next morning, as though it had simply always been that clean, requiring no explanation and inviting no gratitude, because gratitude requires first noticing that work was done. Recall the 2 near misses with the buffer catching on the raised floor mat outside the footlocker. Each one absorbed silently through Gene's forearms rather than his spine. Exactly the kind of skill that leaves no visible trace and therefore earns no visible credit. The 5th pattern, and perhaps the quietest one, is the circularity of the whole arrangement. The fact that Gene spends his entire night erasing the evidence of one day precisely so that an identical day can happen again tomorrow. The scuff marks he buffs out of Corridor A were left there by the exact same kind of foot traffic that will leave new scuff marks there 12 hours from now. The trash he hauls to the compactor will be replaced, can for can, by tomorrow's identical volume of pretzel wrappers and soda cups. There is no finish line in this work, no completed project to point to, only a nightly reset that allows the same performance to run again the next afternoon, curtain up, crowd in, muzak playing, as though nothing at all had happened here while everyone was sleeping. There is a 6th pattern, quieter than the rest, and it may be the most human one of all, which is that people build genuine pride and meaning into work regardless of whether anyone above them is positioned to notice it. Gene takes real satisfaction in a corridor that gleams under fluorescent light, whether or not a single shopper the next morning has any idea what it took to make it gleam. And Thelma takes the same satisfaction in a spotless food court table, and Frank takes it in a building that made it through another night without incident on his own watch. None of them are performing this pride for an audience, since there is no audience left awake to perform for at 3 in the morning. It exists simply because human beings, given almost any task at all, tend to find some way of caring about doing it well. A fact that says something quietly hopeful about people that the economics of their situation never quite manages to erase. None of this is really only a story about a shopping mall in Ohio in 1986. Most of us have stood, at some point, on one side or the other of exactly this kind of invisible line, either as the person whose labor disappears into somebody else's convenience, or as the person who benefited from that labor without ever quite registering who performed it. The particular texture changes from one century to the next and one industry to the next, but the underlying shape of it, effort hidden so that ease can be sold, has proven to be one of the more durable arrangements in the whole history of how people organize their working lives together. Taken together, these patterns describe something larger than one man's job at one mall in one specific autumn. They describe the quiet architecture underneath a great deal of American life in this era, an economy increasingly built on convenience and gleam and effortlessness, sustained by an entire invisible layer of people working hours and jobs the rest of the economy would rather not think about too closely. Gene Ostrowski did not choose this position in the structure. It found him, the way it found a great many men whose factories closed out from under them in these years, and he has made of it, as best he can, a life that includes real friendship and real pride and a real, if modest, peace, even while the larger machine around him keeps him almost entirely out of view. That is worth remembering. Whatever your own place happens to be, in whatever structure currently organizes your days, whether you are the one whose effort gets noticed or the one whose effort simply gets used. The building rarely thanks the people who keep it running. The people, more often than the building deserves, keep running it anyway. The first grey light finds the skylights over the food court a little after 6, thin and colourless at first. The kind of light that does not so much illuminate a room as remind it that morning exists somewhere. Gene notices it while he is coiling the last extension cord back into the supply closet, and he stands for a moment watching it spread slowly across the empty tables below. The neon signs of the food court finally looking a little tired next to actual daylight rather than commanding, the way they command every evening once the sun goes down. Phil Rinaldo arrives at 6:40, coffee in one hand and a ring of keys in the other, unlocking the glass doors near Sears with the brisk cheerfulness of a man who has slept a full ordinary night and is looking forward to an ordinary day. He nods at Gene on his way past, the same nod he gives every morning, and asks whether it was a quiet one. The same question he asks every morning, and Gene tells him it was, which is also what he tells him every morning, since a quiet one is the only kind Gene's job is ever meant to produce. Within 20 minutes, the mall walkers start arriving, the same loose fellowship of retirees making their laps before the shops open and the building begins, gently and without any fanfare at all, turning itself back over to the daylight version of its own life. Gene clocks out at 7 with the same small mechanical stutter the machine has given him every morning for 5 years, and by 7:15 he is walking back out through the loading dock, past the ficus planters he checked at 2 in the morning, past the record store where the new releases from last night's delivery are already being unpacked by a manager who has no idea a driver and a night janitor spent a few minutes discussing them hours earlier. The parking lot outside is nearly empty, just his own Buick and a scattering of employee cars, and the actual morning air, the real November air rather than the mall's engineered spring of it, meets him the way it always does, cold enough to sting his knuckles on the steering wheel for the first mile of the drive home. He drives the 11 miles back to Barberton with the radio finally on, the same call-in show winding down into a morning news update, farm reports and a weather forecast confirming the lake-effect snow due later in the week. The sun is fully up by the time he parks behind the laundromat, and Barberton itself is just beginning its own ordinary day. A paper carrier finishing his route on a bicycle. A diner 2 doors down already smelling of bacon through its propped open kitchen door. A school bus idling at the corner with its lights flashing. Gene walks up the outside stairs to his apartment, moving the way a man moves after 13 hours on his feet, each step a small negotiation with his knees, and Rusty is waiting at the door the moment he turns the key, winding once around his ankles before losing interest and wandering back toward the warm patch of window light he will occupy for most of the coming day. He closes the blinds against a morning that belongs, from here forward, to everyone but him. He eats something small standing at the kitchen counter, the same way he eats most things now, and he checks his answering machine, which holds no messages tonight. And he sets his clipboard down on the small table by the door, already glancing over tomorrow's list out of a habit that will not let him fully rest until he has. Corridor B gets the buffer. The fryers at the pizza place will likely need the degreaser again. Marcus has an exam Friday and might need the lighter duties that night. The list waits there, already partly written before today has even properly ended, the day beginning again in ink before it has finished happening in fact. He calls Denise a little after 8. Catching her between an early class and her own long day of clinical rotations, and the conversation is short and unremarkable in exactly the way Gene prefers his conversations to be. How was work? Fine. How is school? Fine. Are you eating enough? Yes, Dad. And underneath the plainness of it, a warmth passes between them that neither one bothers naming out loud, the specific closeness of two people who have found, since Carol died, that they no longer need very many words to take care of each other. He tells her before they hang up that he is thinking about driving up to see her before her exams. And she tells him that would be nice, and for a moment, standing in his kitchen at 8:15 in the morning with the blinds drawn against a day he will sleep straight through, Gene Ostrowski feels something close to entirely at peace. He is asleep by 9, Rusty curled somewhere near his feet. The radio silent for the first time in 15 hours, the transistor finally switched off and resting on the nightstand beside a photograph of Carol that he has never once needed to look at to remember her face. Outside his window, Barberton goes on with its own daylight version of itself, and 11 miles away, Meadowbrook Galleria fills slowly back up with the mall walkers and the mothers with strollers, and, eventually, the teenagers who will spend another Friday afternoon exactly the way they spent this Thursday, never once wondering who kept the floor so clean beneath their sneakers, or who will be back again tonight. Coveralls pressed, thermos filled, to do it all over. And that was a day, friend. Just one day, in one ordinary life, a long time ago, in a mall that has likely changed beyond recognition by now, if it is even still standing at all. Somewhere out there tonight, whatever hour it happens to be where you are, the floors are clean, and the building is quiet, and the person who made it that way has already gone home to sleep. Let yourself do the same. Good night.